everybody. This is Teris Dunn-Jaglowicz again. I am here this week looking at what a strategy called gallery walks. What one thing I've learned as I started teaching, this is like I told you previously, this is my 6 years teaching. Some people are very familiar with gallery walks. Some people have no idea about them, or some people just know them and don't really have a name to put for them. This is one I probably learned, I think, about my third year teaching, and it goes great if you're, I don't know if you have to follow the 5E teaching model, but in my district, we do have to follow that. So it's working great with that teaching model. Okay, so first things first, what is a gallery walk? So a gallery walk, it typically is one of those, I mean, if you think about it, you think about an art gallery where you walk around and you look at pictures. So with the gallery walk in science, it's very similar. You might look at pictures, you might look at models, you might even look at different scenarios, because I will say I've seen where other content areas have used it as well. And I mostly stick to pictures, though. In the future, I'd like to venture out to use different work reading scenarios. It's a great engagement technique to get the kids up and moving, gets them talking. This is one of those, they can do it individually or they can do it in a group. We've been doing a lot more individual due to COVID, but it's one of those, you can still do it efficiently and socially distant. And I'll also talk about how you can do it in person as well as trying to do it online. It falls to, in my opinion, it falls under differentiated instruction. It's not necessarily by product, it's somewhat differentiation by content. You're gonna have, like I said, you're gonna have different pictures depending on what's going on. And I'll try to give some scenarios of where I've differentiated by not product, but different content. Promotes class discussion. This is a biggie, and it goes along with that engagement technique, because what we'll do, we'll talk about the process, and at the end, how you come back as a whole class, and you break off individually or into your groups or whatever, and you go through and you look at what you're looking at, and you have the discussions and collect your feedback, and then you come back as a whole class at the end to share and discuss and talk about different things. And the kids really enjoy it. They kind of get to see things from a different perspective. You hear a lot of, oh, I didn't even think about it that way, or I didn't even see it that way. So then that last one, students get to show their understanding of content. Depending on how you're doing your gallery walk, you can do it to where the teacher has everything set up already. I use it more so for when students get to show off their product. And this is where I usually get to walk around and I can see the different interpretations and their understanding. They get to show me what they know. I enjoy letting them show me what they know versus me having to say, okay, you got to take this quiz, you got to do this, you got to do that. I feel like I get the best of both worlds. Not to say they still take quizzes here and there, but this gives them a little more freedom. They get to show their creativity, and it's just amazing. All right, so how I can use the gallery walk strategy. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the 5E teaching model, and there's a 5E and there's also a 7E now. But the 5E is engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and then evaluate. So that engagement piece at the beginning, or what everybody knows is your hook or your opening session, this is a very common way to kind of get kids started as you're leading into a new unit or a new lesson. And there's so many different ways you can do it. The most common way that I tend to use it is after an activity or a lab. And this is more where, like, if I break my students up into groups, or if they're individual, and I'll say, okay, this is your task, this is what you have to do. And then at the end, we will place what if it's constructing a model, or if they had to create a poster or a picture of some sort, we would space them out around the classroom. Depending on what it is, sometimes I will even venture out into the hallway just to have a change of scenery for the kids. And they get to walk around and leave feedback and things like that. And then, of course, lastly, it says creating a poster or model. So again, this would be more like, I guess you could say, my elaborate if I was following that 5D model still, or if you want to stick it in there, where you give the students the opportunity again to show one of their creativity, but to mainly allow them to demonstrate what they know and understand or what they have learned during that unit or lesson plan. Again, the main thing that has to be taken away from gallery walks or what the students should see is that they have to have that student feedback portion. The sole purpose of the gallery walk is to kind of gather that feedback, whether if it's something that's an introduction or something that's kind of towards the end or in the middle. And then secondly, that class discussion and debrief. I kind of compare it to if I was to grade something and give it back to the kids. If I don't give feedback to them, then it's kind of pointless. So the same thing with galleries. So both will go hand in hand. If they've done the feedback, it kind of defeats the purpose if they have not had that discussion. So that's just to kind of close it out as well. Okay. So as one strategy that I will use in person is what I like to call a summary poster. The way I send it to the students is that pretty much I say, think of it as if you were creating a poster that I would need to put up in my classroom for future students for them to see, okay, well, this is what energy is or energy is about, or this is what atoms are about. I tell them, I remind them about the different learning posters that they may see in the classroom. So the first thing is that I give them their requirement, and I have to make sure that I'm clear on my requirements. So I leave them visible at all times on the board. I have a sonic view board, and I know some people may still have a smart board, and this is, this first part is if you're doing this person. So I make sure I put the requirements on the board, and I leave them there the entire time, but I also make sure that I explain the requirements to them as well. So that gives them time to ask me questions and clarification. So this is just a little bit of an example of these other little bullet points from the last summary poster that I did for in-person. So the students had to create a poster that discussed conduction, induction, and friction. At the time, we were talking about the distribution in charges, or distribution of charges, mainly in conductors and insulators. So this at the top, this would say, okay, this is what you're doing. This is your topic. The student actual requirements were they had to include description and or explanations for each process. So I should see a description or explanation for conduction, induction, as well as friction. They had to give me examples, which for this topic I put scenarios in parentheses because a lot of the examples for this poster were more so scenarios. For example, the kids would say, okay, well, if I rub a balloon on my hair, right there, that's friction, and then they might start to explain a little further. But the main thing is that they gave that main scenario, which is an example. So we did discuss the difference, somewhat the difference between the two. Lastly, I tell them they have to include pictures or diagrams, and of course color, because I'm like, who wants to look at a poster with no color? And they're like, yeah, you got a point there. I said, yes, it wouldn't draw your attention to it. So I just kind of remind them, as I said before, think of the posters that you see in class, especially when you kind of zone out and you're not really kind of spaced out in class, you're not paying attention, but you're looking at everything else that's going on. So I usually give them about half a class period to a day to do that one. It just depends on the information that has to be on there. A lot of times it ends up being a day, and what kind of holds the kids up, and not really holds the kids up, they really get into the pictures and diagrams more than anything. I'm sorry. Okay, and then lastly, so for the actual gallery walk portion of it, we would place the posters up either around the classroom or in the hallway. Sometimes I'll do both, where I'll put some in the classroom and some in the hallway just to kind of break everybody up. And in this scenario, I like to give sticky notes just to give the kids a chance to write their feedback down and leave the sticky note on the poster, so that way they're not destroying the posters or anything like that. And we do have a discussion about feedback because I told them the main thing with feedback is that I'm looking for something positive or constructive. And I don't want to see, oh, this is a really nice poster, or oh, I didn't really like the pictures aren't that good. I want something to be meaningful because I tell them you're focusing on the content of the poster. You're not focusing on how pretty it is. So I have to remind them, okay, make sure you're looking at what descriptions or explanations they've written first. Are the descriptions and explanations correct based on the topic you're talking about? Do the examples match the scenario? Did that person clearly explain something? And it's not to say that they've written a whole paragraph on the poster, but what they have put on there, is that content correct? Is it accurate, and does it match? Especially with the picture. So, and I usually try to save some of the sticky notes from year to year when I do gallery walks so that I can read off some of the feedback to the kids and say, okay, this is what I'm looking for. This is not what I'm looking for. I do with eighth graders, and they're in that funny phase still. I do have to remind them, okay, make sure it's meaningful, make sure you're not saying something that you might think you're trying to be funny and it's mean. So I said there's a purpose behind it. We all have a job to do. So another gallery walk that I do, and I do this one just about every year. And I actually just recently did this one, so I have some samples to show. For this gallery walk, we just started talking about motion and acceleration, speed, and velocity. So what the students had to do in this case is that I read the story of the tortoise and the hare to them. And I just Googled one online, and it was one that kind of had some humor to it. So it had things like, oh, they stopped at McDonald's, and then they stopped and did this and did that. So once I read the story to them, the students were tasked with graphing the race of the tortoise and the hare. So this lesson, I actually learned about this at a NAFTA workshop, and this is when they were kind of not truly introducing 5E to us, but just kind of training us in how to correctly do 5E. So those of you that are familiar with 5E, this is one of those activities. You could do it as your explore portion, where the kids are actually exploring and trying to discover on their own first. Or you can do it as a part of their elaborate, where they are showing you what they've acquired. And that elaborate kind of overlaps with evaluate, because that's the same thing. If you're evaluating, the kids are showing you what they've learned or acquired. So from that point, you can do it in a group or you can do it individual. This year, I actually did it individual. I gave all the kids computer paper. Normally, I would do it in a group, and it would take about a day. So each graph, once they finished it, each graph is placed around the classroom or in the hallway. Now, and I still followed some of the same requirements as the summary poster. It had to be, they had to make sure they had color. They had to make sure that they had both animals on the graph. I did go ahead and tell them that it had to be a line graph, just to be on the safe side, because I didn't want to turn them loose and they say, okay, well, what kind of graph am I supposed to do? So I did go ahead and tell them it had to be a line graph, and we talked about how we're comparing things. And I told them they had to give me a key. So with the colors, with the two lines, they had to give me a key saying, okay, this line represents the tortoise, this line represents the hare. I did give them the opportunity, if they wanted to draw pictures on the graph, I let them do that. I didn't say anything about it, it was one of those the kids just kind of took it and ran with it, and they added that, and I have pictures of that to show you. So we did do the sticky note again. Now I will say I've seen some teachers where they've done the gallery walk. Maybe they have created a template and they have numbered all the pictures or numbered each product, and they have to write their feedback on that paper, which is probably a little more discreet as well. And then that way you don't have to worry about someone necessarily being embarrassed. But the sticky notes, I will say, I have not seen a negative side about it that's been embarrassing. And then again, so once we've read the story, they've made the graph, they walk around and they place their feedback, but what they are, and again, they're looking at positive or constructive criticism feedback. They are looking at the graph to see, okay, did this person or did this group accurately and correctly graph the race? So did they have all the stops of the race? And the main thing they focus with on this is the line on the graph. So in this story, the version that I read, they started at the start line. Their first stop was the side of the road. Their second stop was McDonald's. Their third stop was under a tree. Well, the hair stop, I should say. So this is just some of the graphs that the kids did. And as they were walking around, they started to notice that the lines were different on each graph. So this graph, it may not be the prettiest, but they know this one says the examples are correct, but they said the graph may not be labeled correctly because they were focusing on just the time graph. So this person noticed that, okay, the person that made this graph put distance on the x-axis instead of the y-axis. So that's something that I would see as a teacher as I'm walking around looking at some of the feedback. Okay, maybe this person got confused or misinterpreted, or there's a misunderstanding somewhere. Another thing that I forgot to mention with these, anytime we put them up, I've never had the kids put their name on the front. If they put their name on it, I tell them to put it on the back. And for the most part, I've never to date have had a student flip it over and say, oh, let's see who did this one. They know to pretty much stay on task because I'm circulating around behind them the whole time to make sure, okay, do you understand this correctly? And I like to ask them questions too about the feedback that they receive. Now the other one, this one, I don't know that I would consider this necessarily bad feedback, but they put makes no sense and the graph was not labeled. And as we debriefed as a class, I said, now I would not put that it does not make sense. And one of my students, they said, well, when you write feedback for us, sometimes you just say, this is not clear or understandable. I say, okay, so what should maybe that person put instead? They were saying, well, maybe we should put it's not clear. So it's a learning thing for everybody. As we debriefed, they also noted that the lines kind of stopped in the middle of the graph. And then if you look at this graph over here, this student kind of took it above and beyond. They drew the tortoise and then the hare, and they labeled the stops. And for the most part, they accurately graphed the story. They noted all the stops that the hare made, and they noted how the tortoise was slow and steady. Now again, they like to still slide in the nice drawing and things like that. So you do see a sticky note with those nice drawings. Okay, so here are two more graphs, and this just kind of showed me when I was walking around. I asked the kids, I said, do y'all know what I mean by a key? And it might have been that I used the wrong word. They kind of looked at me funny. So then I said, do you know what a legend is? And I had a couple raise their hand, and they said, yeah, that's that thing where if you see, you're looking at something and you have all these different colors and it tells you what color is what. I said, okay, so a key is like a legend. So that is where that kind of pointed something out for me, even though it's like nothing to do with science, but that just shows me, okay, they're not necessarily familiar with that terminology, this class. So this graph again, they said they had their key where they labeled, okay, one line is the tortoise, the other line is the hare. And they actually drew the stops, which I thought was pretty funny. But again, the students, as we debriefed as a whole class, and one thing I will say, some of the sticky notes fell off, but as a whole class, when we debriefed, one student mentioned that they said it looks like the lines just kind of stop in the middle of the graph. Whereas the other one, we have the same thing with the feedback about the key. So I tell them, like one person said there is no key, which this one, both of these actually had a key, but they mentioned that it had overall good work. So my thing with this one, I said, so there, we didn't say anything constructive, or maybe that person didn't think about the content. They may have forgotten to look at the content of this graph. All right, this last one, and this one's kind of funny, but a lot of people noted when we debriefed as a whole class, they said, well, on this graph, they took their lines all the way to the finish line, and they included the finish line. So that was one of those, I did not tell the kids that they had to do the finish line. The only thing I told them was that they had to make sure all the locations were on the graph that were in the story where they stopped. Well, some of the kids thought, okay, well, there's the start line, and then they also stopped at the finish line. So you did have some that made sure they included the finish line as well. And this is just another one. And somebody, again, like we mentioned earlier, they wrote very understandable. And I had some other ones, they wrote things like, I think your lines are backwards. They noticed that one person said, okay, instead of saying that the red line was for the hare, they said it was for the hare, but then maybe drew a turtle right there, and it just completely did not match. So they started to point out things like that with the content. And then, like I said earlier, with the lines, that was the main thing that they were looking for, because we were working our way into interpreting motion graphs and the different types of motion graphs. All right, so the main question, can a gallery walk be done virtually as well? The answer is yes. So when I first talked to the first webinar, I talked about engagement, and we discussed not trying to completely do everything that you would do in person online, but this is one of those that it can be done. It's just got to be modified a little bit. I have done some of them this year with my students, but I did not save any samples when I did it because this year it was trial and error. So the first suggestion would be a Zoom breakout room. So let's say if I was to do another poster or even that same tortoise and hare activity. Last year when I did try doing it, when I was 100% virtual in the spring, I had the students still draw the graph out on paper and scan it in, and they scanned it into a Google folder that I created. And from there, I was able to kind of assign different students to be hosts. So like right here, it says create a Google folder, you place everything in there, you set up your breakup room, and I feel like for the most part, you're able to find a student that you can trust, that you don't mind them sharing their screen. I feel like that, especially for 8th grade, I feel like they can handle that. And while they're in their little breakout group, that person that's sharing the screen will pull up each picture, and they verbally discuss it, and they can record their feedback down on paper. And all this is while they're in the breakout room. So then they would come back to the main room, and when they come back to the main room, we would still do that debrief as a whole class, just like we would if we were in person. Because like I mentioned earlier, the main thing with gallery walks, the two important things is you make sure you have the student feedback and you have that discussion or that debriefing session. So that's one way you could do it, is with the Zoom breakout room. Now, I did not mention this on here. I was hoping to have mastered this by the time we recorded, but I'm still working out some kinks with it. I know a lot of the districts or schools are Google support, and you have Google accounts. You can use Jamboards, and I'm still trying to work all that out. I'm having some kinks with that, so hopefully I can give you a follow up with the Jamboard. But I will say Jamboard can be used. I know it can be used. I just have not mastered it yet. Another app that can be used, and it's actually been a while since I've used this app, is Padlet. And what you would do with this one is the kids would just go in online and Padlet and create what they're going to create. And they have different options, like you can create a collage or wall art gallery. You let the students pick which one works for them, or you can tell them. So I included the link to get to the instructions on how to do that. And then it kind of falls back into that breakout session too. Or you don't have to do a breakout session. They can just upload it into that Google folder or Microsoft folder, whichever one your district uses, or Canvas. How I know there's so many different platforms that everybody's using now. So whatever your platform works for you. But if they're sharing it with you, and that way as a whole class you can go through it together. Or if you still want to set it to where on their own time the students can go in each folder and look at each picture and do it individually, and then when you have your class meeting, you can debrief that way. There's just so much flexibility and so many ways you can do it. You just have to do what works for you and what works for your students. So just some reminders, some tips, whether it's in-person gallery walk or virtual gallery walk. Make sure you give clear instructions off the bat. I have to remind my students, okay, make sure you're listening to me. Don't be doing anything else. Don't be touching anything. If they're in person, don't try to gather supplies while I'm talking. If they're virtual, you're not sitting there playing with your phone while I'm explaining. I need your full undivided attention. And like I mentioned earlier, I still display my instruction and requirements on the board, but also I'm constantly reminding them too. Because if you're doing it online and you're doing a breakout room, the good thing with breakout rooms is that you can pop in and out in each room as a host. Practice makes perfect with this strategy. It's not something that they're going to get overnight. With gallery walks this year, trying to navigate COVID, as far as my in person, I did not start doing them right away like I normally would. Like I normally would do a gallery walk in the very first unit we start with Adam. I would have started right then during that unit. But it kind of took some time because we were trying to braise this and try to braise it safely and see what we could get away with and maybe not get away with so much and keep everybody safe. And we were limited on technology even in person at the time, because I will say I've done the folders and things like that to where instead of the kids being up walking around, I may have set up the Google folder already for them in Google Classroom, and they can do the gallery walk that way virtually, even though they're in person. And we just kind of discuss it as a whole class that way. Lastly, as always, give models and examples. I try to save my models every year, and if I can't save them because they take up space, I try to take a picture of it and save it so that the kids can see. That way, it just kind of gives them a better idea. Not necessarily, okay, I have to copy this exactly, but okay, I know what I need to work towards now, or what she's expecting and looking for. And like I've already said, there's so many different ways you can do it. It does not have to be just pictures. It does not have to just be creating a model or something to view. There have been times where I've done a gallery walk and there are different scenarios, and the students have to read the scenario and make a decision, things like that. You could also, I previously talked about plain evidence reasoning writing. You could probably combine that as well into the gallery walk strategy, combining two strategies together into one as well. Okay, I'll leave these sources at the end. If you want more information on gallery walks, NSTA is a great resource, as well as DSTA. So National Science Teacher Association and the Georgia Science Teacher Association. These two links are also they also include information, and this is the link about the Padlet gallery walk that I mentioned earlier, in case you wanted to kind of look through and see the different details and things like that. I would love to hear if you use this strategy. What are some ways you would use it, or if you think you want to try using it and you need some assistance, please let me know, and I can hopefully guide you in the right direction. That's all I have for you today, and good luck.